So these verses continue to be misused by many to teach that women should remain silent in the church. And by silent, they mean totally silent. No prayers, no nothing, as we say down here in the South. But Paul says that God has given gifts equally to men and women. And there's really no evidence that the spiritual or charismatic gifts, for example, listed in this passage in 1 Corinthians 12, apply only to men. For example, as you can see, Paul says, one is given this, to another is given that, and the body is one with many members, and so on. And then in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul wants women to pray and prophesy as long as they do not dishonor their husbands. And you can compare this to Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost in the book of Acts, where he says that your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Paul defines prophecy as someone who speaks to people for their upbuilding and encouragement and consolation. So the word prophecy does not only have the meaning of predictive prophecy, that is, predicting future events. In other words, Paul cannot be contradicting himself by placing a supposed permanent ban on women speaking in church. Nor is Paul saying, I think, that this teaching or speaking from women applies only to speaking or teaching children. For example, Titus 2, Paul commands older women to teach and train younger women. In Philippians 4, Paul names women who he says have struggled together in the gospel ministry, along with me and Clement and my other co-workers. And also in Acts 18, Luke says that Priscilla taught a man called Apollos. So from this context, that the meaning or the warning that Paul gives in 1 Corinthians 14 has to do with some women questioning other prophets in an argumentative or unchristian way. That could be possibly what Paul is talking about. For example, the noted scholar F.F. Bruce, the prohibition expressed in 1 Corinthians 14 refers to the asking of questions which imply a judgment on prophetic utterances. So at least their context suggests. This is in agreement with many other Bible studies, Bible commentators, and scholars. For example, the New English Translation Bible, on their comment on 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34. The better suggestion is to relate it to the preceding regulations about evaluating the prophets, as Paul said in verse 29. So this could explain the disorder Paul is alluding to and why the issue is specific to women only. Now let's look at this passage in 1 Timothy 2. I think what's always ignored or missed, perhaps due to the uninspired chapter breaks, is the fact that Paul, this section of scripture, goes on to explain what he means by not allowing a woman to oversee a man. For example, in 1 Timothy 3, Paul goes on to limit the office of an overseer, also known as a pastor or an elder or a presbyter, to males only by the phrase the husband of one wife, which literally in the Greek means a one-woman man. By the way, Paul's presupposition that a man is to be faithfully married does not, of course, exclude a single Christian man as being disqualified from this position. Paul himself, we believe, was probably single, and elsewhere, Paul even recognized celibacy as perfectly suitable for ministry. The ESV Study Bible note on 1 Timothy 2:12 explains that since the role of pastor, elder, or overseer is rooted in the task of teaching and exercising authority over the church, this verse would also exclude women from serving in this office, and that's what Paul goes on to talk about in the next chapter. Thus, when Paul calls for the women to be quiet, he means quiet with respect to the teaching responsibility that is limited in the assembled church. Paul elsewhere indicates that women do speak in other ways in the church assembly. See 1 Corinthians 11:5. And also, Paul is likely in the Corinthians passage forbidding women to speak up and judge prophecies. This is the activity in the immediate context. The Net Bible again adds that the phrase remain quiet in reference to women is used in Greek literature either of absolute silence or of a quiet demeanor. For example, if you look back to 2 Thessalonians 3:12, Paul uses the same Greek word to urge some in the church, men and women, to do their work quietly. Hence, my paraphrase of this difficult verse: the woman is not to oversee the church by taking on the teaching and authority of the male elder, but instead she should maintain a quiet demeanor. And then finally, in 1 Timothy 2:13 and 14, Paul has already given a twofold biblical reason for this prohibition he has placed on females. By one, appealing to the order of the original Genesis creation, Adam was formed first, then Eve. In other words, this is not a social or cultural argument Paul is making, but from creation itself. Secondly, he notes the total deception of Eve, and Adam was not deceived. The woman, because she was completely deceived, fell into sin. By the way, I'm using Sir Anthony Buzzard's One God, the Father translation here, / paraphrase. In summary, I don't think those passages, 1 Corinthians 14, 1 Timothy 2, do away with the fact that elsewhere Paul says, teach and admonish each other with all the wisdom that he gives. As I was doing this study once again, I noticed the other day that we have addressed this issue and similar issues at least half a dozen times over the years. So for any future reference and or questions, I would ask you to please do a search of our homepage or a search of our YouTube channel. And just quickly here, if you scroll down at the bottom, you see there's search. You can just type in any word related to this topic, women, elders, pastor teaching, etc. And it should take you to any of those articles. As you can see, we have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/focus on the kingdom. If you click there, it will take you to our channel. And again, on the right here, if you can see it, pointer, you see that little magnifying glass. So you can just, again, once again, just type in women or elders, and I'll give you an example, women. So we have women, teachers, pastors, prophets, according to Paul, are women to remain silent in church, and all references to women. And then there's another one, ordination of women in the Church of God General Conference. That's a very important one, by the way.